Well, greetings to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I am Dr. James Bushur, the Director of Deaconess Formation, as well as Assistant Professor of Church History here at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne. And it's my privilege this morning, or today, to lead you through the Gospel reading for the Feast of Pentecost. And our reading is John 15, 26 to 27, as well as John 16, 4b to 15. And of course, these verses from John's Gospel focus on the mission of the Spirit, certainly very appropriate to the Feast of Pentecost. But before we jump into the text directly, it might be helpful to kind of place these verses within the context of John's Gospel and where we are in John's Gospel. So maybe just briefly, in terms of the context, John 15 and 16 is part of the farewell discourse of Jesus in John's Gospel. It takes place on Maundy Thursday night and kind of represents his final words to the disciples as he's going to the cross and to accomplish the salvation of the world. And I think there's a few themes that we might look at and might keep in mind that have been that are very prevalent throughout the farewell discourse. We can say here that finally, at this point, the hour has come for Jesus. Indeed, he has spoken about his hour since the very beginning of John's Gospel. The opening miracle at Cana in Galilee, Jesus had spoken of his hour, the very hour for which he has entered into the world. There at the wedding of Cana, he had said his hour has not yet come. But now as he has entered into Jerusalem in John chapter 12, and in fact, at the very moment when he's entered into Jerusalem, and there are Greeks who ask to see Jesus, Jesus now declares that his hour has come. And then now on Maundy Thursday night, as he washes the disciples' feet, he again speaks about his hour. In fact, in John 13 verse 1, just read it briefly. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father. And so he has the Passover feast with his disciples, washes their feet. Also, you have the kind of intriguing text about Judas now leaving to betray Jesus. At the very moment the morsel of bread entered Judas' mouth, it says that Satan entered him, and then he departs from the fellowship of the disciples. And it's at that very occasion now that the farewell discourse begins. In 13:31, it says that when Judas had gone out, Jesus says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and in him God is glorified." So this is this farewell discourse on Maundy Thursday night, very passionate, poignant words that Jesus now speaks to his disciples. And a couple of themes that we might keep in mind that have kind of recur throughout this farewell discourse. The first one is the theme of Jesus going to the Father. He speaks about his cross, his passion as a going to the Father. In some ways, this is the very converse of what is spoken earlier in John's Gospel in terms of Jesus as the coming one, that he comes into the world. For God so loved the world that he sent his Son into the world. Even the woman at the well speaks of the Messiah as the coming one. But now as we've reached the end of John's Gospel, he speaks about going to the Father, departing from the world back to the Father. And of course, we saw that already in John 13, but also John 14, where Jesus speaks those very familiar words, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so he typically will speak of his cross as the very way of ascent that leads to the Father. So that's one thing that we want to keep in mind also in our text. A second one, of course, is the very prominent place of love. You're well aware, no doubt, of Maundy Thursday, the new commandment that Jesus gives to love one another. But this is a love that began even in the Father. The Father loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And it is this love that Jesus now wants to define the church's fellowship. It is this love that will bind us to one another. And so he speaks a great deal about this love, especially I think in John 15 with the image of the vine and the branches. And that greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And we might say a couple emphases in regard to that notion of the fellowship of love. One is that Jesus' love is generative. I think that's part of the image of the vine and the branches. From the beginning, Jesus has spoken of himself and his very mission as to generate the children of God. Those who are born not of the will of the flesh or of the desire of man, nor of blood, but born of God. That's all the way back in the prologue. And of course you're aware of John 3 and the whole how are the children of God to be born? They're to be born of water and the Spirit. And now here also in John 15, apart from Christ as the vine, we can do nothing. But we are branches now grafted into the vine and become, therefore, branches that can give life. And I think certainly within the context, the image of the vine is certainly an image of the cross as the very embodiment of this love that binds us together and binds us together with the Father. The second aspect of this love that I think we want to keep in mind is its geographical character. Sometimes I think missed, and I think in fact in our immediate context, this love that binds the fellowship together also creates the hatred of the world. The world is going to reject the disciples, reject Christ, and therefore reject the church. And very much in John's Gospel, this battle with the devil, with sin, with death, with the world, is a geographical battle. I might put it this way, that I think for John, and for many in the early church that were facing a very pagan, hostile environment, they thought of the original sin that was a geographical sin. That is to say that when Adam sinned, the devil gained a presence in, with, and under the sinning of mankind. That in and through the sinner, the devil's presence begins to spread. He gains a foothold in this world. And of course it is that geography of evil and of sin and of death that has dominated the world since the fall of Adam. Well, I think the way John kind of presents the gospel is that now when the Word becomes flesh, God again gains a kind of foothold. The Word gains a foothold in this world. He is a light that has come to pierce the darkness and begins this geographical battle that's going to continue in the church. The church is going to be the ongoing presence of this light as it seeks to cast out evil and sin. And I think you can see that geographical interest of John throughout his gospel. The whole notion of the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. The emphasis on the Feast of Tabernacles. Even now in our text, he talks about abiding in Him, remaining in Him, which is language that is geographical in its character. So there we want to keep that emphasis in front of us, especially as it relates now to this battle with the world. And maybe the last thing to just briefly mention is the place of the Spirit in John's Gospel. The Spirit has had a prominent place throughout the narrative of John, all the way back in 132, where John the Baptist speaks and he recognizes Jesus as the Christ because the Spirit came down upon him. And then John speaks of Jesus' mission in terms of the Spirit. Right, that Jesus has come to baptize with the Spirit. That's the very mission of Jesus. So the Spirit is integral to Jesus' very identity as the Messiah and also His mission now in the world to baptize and generate the children of God. And of course that leads us to John 3 and the discussion with Nicodemus that the children of God will be generated now not by a second time in the mother's womb but by water and the Spirit. In John 4:23, with the Samaritan woman, the Spirit is the very geography of the worship of God. There, the woman at the well, if you remember, talked about the proper geography for the worship of God, and Jesus said, the true worshipers worship in spirit and in truth. And in John 7 is the next place where we get a good mention of the Spirit, 37 to 39, where Jesus speaks of the rivers of living water that will come right out of His own being. In fact, it seems that the rock of Horeb is one of the texts. It's certainly in the background. That Jesus is the rock, and out of Him will come these rivers of living water that John says refers to the Spirit. And then we might even look forward from there to following our text, John 19. It is at the cross when His side is pierced, that in and with that blood and water, the Spirit is now handed over. This is where the baptism of the Spirit now begins. And then John 20, when He breathes on His apostles, so that the apostles now share in His own mission as the Son of God, forgiving and retaining sins. Well, all of those texts emphasize the place of the Spirit now in Jesus' mission to generate the children of God. But what is especially important about our text as we get into it is that John 15 and 16, more than any other place, now actually defines for us the mission of the Spirit, why He is going to be given by Christ and for what reason. And so with that little introduction, let us turn to the text and make our way through it, starting here with John 15, 26 to 27. And maybe the first thing to kind of recognize here is the Trinitarian character. In fact, if we can even maybe draw a line here, we can just mention this. I think maybe there is some reason why the Lectionary Committee began and then also ended the text where they did, because it does end in a Trinitarian location, right? You can kind of see it here in 26 with, you can see Jesus here. He is the one who's going to send, and He's going to send the Spirit from the Father, right? The Spirit of truth, who again proceeds from the Father. We'll talk about that a little bit. And of course the Spirit, again, relationship to Jesus, will testify concerning Jesus. So certainly you get Jesus here, His relationship to the Spirit emphasized, but of course also the Father. And of course in 15, the same kind of thing. We're going to have the Father mentioned, and we'll get to that a little bit later. We also have, of course, that He will receive from Jesus, and He will declare to you. So we do have a kind of nice Trinitarian beginning and ending to our text. Okay. But now getting into the specifics of it, starting with verse 26. And maybe the first place to mention is the significance of the notion of the Paraclete. He speaks about when the Paraclete comes. And of course there are many ways perhaps to translate parakletos and the notion of the Paraclete. Maybe advocate, maybe counselor, all of this kind of language. But I think, whatever way we translate it, I think maybe the most interesting aspect of it is the intimacy. The intimacy that it wants to communicate. Of course, paraclete is a word that has been used by John a few places. We might mention those, 14:20, 14:16, and 14, also 26, and 16, as well as 16, verse 7. But in all those places, I think if you look at it, parakletos wants to communicate a fundamental kind of intimacy of the Spirit's relationship to Christ, but also especially His relationship to the church. He is going to be the counselor. And in fact, in this regard, maybe it's worthwhile mentioning St. Irenaeus, who was a disciple of John, uses this language, and he says, for instance, that our God is a God of counsel, not of compulsion. And I think that's actually a helpful way to think about how he is understanding, for instance, the notion of parakletos. That he is a God of counsel who's always coming to man and advising him concerning sin and concerning righteousness. In fact, I think kind of in mind there is the whole history of salvation. If you think of something like Cain, who right in the middle of his passionate battle, God comes to him with advice and counsel to not let the sin take root in him. Of course, he relates to Abraham, as Abraham was the friend of God. God is always there to counsel him. Certainly Moses, God says, I will be with you to teach you what you should say. And so the intimacy of the Spirit's presence with the church is going to be highlighted by this notion of parakletos, of the paraclete, which is going to be mentioned again, of course, a little bit later here in 16, verse 7. Thus the Spirit, and I think maybe another word that's helpful here is the language of comforter. That in the context of the farewell address, as Jesus is departing and going to the Father, He's not going to leave the church desolate. The Spirit is going to be there, to counsel them and to be with them and to continue to testify. Okay, so that's a little bit about parakletos. You can see then, we get in the next phrases, we get two verbs here. First, Jesus relates to the Spirit by sending Him. You can see the future tense verb there, pemso, which indicated typically for Christians that the Spirit is now going to be sent with a specific mission in mind. He's coming to share now in the very mission of Jesus Himself. Of course, Jesus Himself spoke of Himself as one sent by the Father into the world. And now within that sending, the Spirit will be sent to continue that mission of Jesus, to bring it maybe to its fruition, to its fulfillment. But we get a different tense verb here in the next phrase. So not only I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who is from the Father, who is proceeding, the present tense verb. This, of course, always, if the pemso or the pempo language indicated kind of the mission of the Spirit in the history of salvation. Ek paruatai, this indicates the very, shall we say, ontology of the Spirit. That He is the proceeding one, that's the present tense. There's no beginning and end to this proceeding. This is His relationship to the Father that we have kind of distinguished there. But maybe then, most importantly here in this verse, is now the final verb that gives us now the first expression concerning the mission of the Spirit, which is that this one shall testify. He shall witness. He shall the martyr language is there, and I do think it's significant here, the martyr language in this text, because we're in the context of the hatred of the world. And martyr has a certain significance there, that the Spirit comes for martyrdom. That is, to testify, to witness concerning Jesus. And this is a theme that John has developed. We might just mention a few places where we get this language of witnessing all the way back to John 1, 7, and 15 that talked about John the Baptist as a witness. You might also look at John 3, where Jesus speaks about we witness concerning what we have seen, 3:11. And that's actually an important theme to kind of recognize with martyrese, that he will testify. A witness, a martyr, is not simply someone who remembers past events. Rather, for John, a martyr is one in whom past events are present. The martyr speaks in the present tense. In fact, the way John thinks of it, when you hear this martyr language, you have to think of the eyes. You witness to what you have seen, And for John, what that kind of means is that these events enter into the eyes of the martyr, like the cross of Jesus, the resurrection. They enter into the eyes of the martyr, and now they live there. They remain a present reality within the martyr. So the martyr is always one for whom the events are present, and so he speaks in the present. In fact, you can see that kind of beautifully there, and also in 1 John 1. You might look at 1 John chapter 1 at how the Apostle John speaks of his own place as an apostle. He says, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have touched. And then he speaks in the present. We proclaim that to you. So that in the present proclamation, the past is not past. It's actually present. It's a living reality. And this is because of the Spirit. The Spirit comes now concerning martyrdom, concerning the witness concerning Jesus Christ. That Jesus, His presence is not going to be limited to the past, but is going to be ongoing. And then, of course, the reason I think that's so significant is that it now defines this witnessing of the Spirit, defines now who the disciples are. That as Jesus now departs to the Father, therefore also, this Kai relating the two here, the testifying of the Spirit, and now the testimony of the apostles. You are, and you can see here, the present tense of martyrete. You are, and even este. You are witnesses because you have been with me from the beginning. And again, that notion of with me, the intimacy of that, right? That they can speak now in the present, that Jesus' presence is not past. It remains a present reality precisely in their testimony that is going to take place in and through the Spirit. Okay. Well, that's certainly at the heart of our text. We want to now skip down to John 16, 4b to 15. And in between that, obviously you can look at the verses at the beginning of chapter 16, which have to do with martyrdom and have to do with, in fact, we might just mention them here. John 16, 1 to 4 emphasizes a bit the persecution that will happen because of the world's hatred. Maybe I can just read a few of these verses. I have said all this to you to keep you from falling away. They will put you out of synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming. There's that language, the hour is coming, when whoever kills you will think he is offering a service to God. And they will do this because they have not known the Father, nor have they known me, Jesus says. There's the Trinitarian character again. But I have said these things to you that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you of them. Okay? So again, the martyr context is front and center, the hostility with the world. And so, that then brings us to the rest of this text, John 16, just to hit a few of the highlights here. You can see, I think you have to hear kind of the passion of Jesus, that from the beginning, I have not told you these things from the beginning, and He has not told them these things because He was with them, right? He was with them. Now that He is leaving, now that He is going to the Father, now He has to take up this discourse, especially emphasizing the Spirit and the sending of the Spirit and the importance now of the fellowship of the church. And the institution of the church even. And so he then begins in verse 5, you can see the little word now. The time has changed. He's no longer going to be with them, but He's going to leave, right? Now I am departing. I am going to the one who sent me. And there's that language of going to the Father. From the beginning, there has been a strong emphasis, I think, for John on the notion of the way. Not only John 14, I am the way, the very explicit reality of that. I am the way, no one comes to the Father but by me. But all the way back in John 1, in his discourse or his exchange with Nathanael, he had spoken of the cross, I think, and this is how early Christians certainly understood Jesus, and I think it's right, the cross is a ladder. A ladder upon which the angels of God are ascending and descending, and certainly a reference to Jacob's ladder. Early Christians all kind of thought, in fact you get early sermons, that what Jacob saw in his dream was the crucified Christ. He saw the cross. In fact, Jacob of Serug, for instance, begins his sermon on Jacob's ladder with the statement that the Lord stood upon the cross as on a ladder with many rungs. And so the notion of the cross as the way that now will unite man with God, that allows man to come into the presence of the Father. This is kind of, I think, a crucial theme of John. He's emphasized it also, if you want to keep considering some other text, certainly John 10, when Jesus speaks of Himself as the door to the sheep. In fact, in that discourse of Him as the door, He talks about the thief and the robber are those who try to ascend. They try to ascend by some other way. And I think that's a very kind of interesting statement. I think for Jesus, there's only one way to ascend to the Father. And that way, of course, is going to be the cross. And so I think he brings that back here in our text. He is departing to the Father. But He does that not to leave the apostles and the disciples and the church, but actually to join them to the Father. To bring them into the presence of the Father, to join the Father and the church into one fellowship, one family of the children of God. And so he says, and also no one from among you asks me, where are you going? In fact, the religious leaders had asked Him where He is going. But He now, by this time in the farewell discourse, it knows that the disciples know where He is going, expect that they know where He is going, namely to the Father. But verse 6, these things I have preached to you, la leka, has the kind of notion of discourse to you, preached to you. These things have filled your heart with lupe, with grief, with sorrow. And the reason that's significant, and really you can hear the passionate character of that, but from the beginning of the farewell discourse, Jesus has talked about your hearts being troubled. But this sorrow is something that's going to play a big part in the rest of John 16. And just, for your consideration here, lupe is always associated with Eve and the fall of man. Even Adam will till the ground in sorrow. But Eve especially, it talks about her, she will bear children in sorrow. It's not in pain you will bring forth children, but in sorrow, in lupe, you will bring forth children. And it's this lupe that Eve, the way early Christians understood that, her grief is not just the pain of childbirth, but her grief is the fact that she knows her child will die, that her child is now ruled by death. It is the sorrow and the grief over death. Well, it is precisely this lupe, this sorrow of death, that is going to be turned into joy in the text that follows our own. And of course, I think this is what the Spirit does. He is the one who will bring joy out of lupe. And of course, that's what the resurrection does. There, Mary will receive her son back again in joy. So that lupe is, I think, a rather significant term that you want to kind of consider. Well, in verses 7 and 8, then we get a strong statement now again about the mission of the Spirit. Verse 7, and I now speak to you the truth. This is, we might even have here a little bit of recalling of Jesus as the Logos, right? That He is the one from the Father who is the Word, who speaks. And now He, as the Logos, now speaks, and He speaks the truth. And that it is for your advantage. In fact, this verb, sum fere, is kind of an interesting, it can just mean generically it is for your benefit, but the word itself means to kind of bind together or to bring together. And it might have a little bit of that connotation here, that He goes away, that He departs precisely to bind us together. This is how it is to our advantage, because it is precisely going to unite us in this fellowship of love, in this fellowship of the Spirit. And so that sum fere language you might pay attention to. I think it may have a little bit of emphasis there in gathering the church. In John chapter 12, Jesus had said He is lifted up, that He might draw all peoples to Himself. And so here also, I go that I might now kind of bring you together. For if I do not go away, He says, the Paraclete shall not come to you. But if I go, and as I go, I again will send Him. This Pempso language that we've gotten throughout, right? He talked about His Father as the one who sent Him, and earlier He talked about the Pempso, the mission of Jesus. As I go, now the Spirit comes within the mission of Jesus, and He will now come to you. Now, what does He do? Verse 8 gives us kind of the mission statement of the Spirit, that He comes elexe. That verb is a rhetorical term which has the idea of kind of to prove or to make clear, even to make a display. It is, and it also has a little bit of the sense of to refute, to debate, to fight. And I think maybe in the presence, in the context of the world, the world's hostility, that might need to be emphasized. But He's going to convince the world, show the world concerning sin, concerning righteousness, and concerning judgment. Concerning sin, here I think especially because the world does not believe in Him, He makes sin clear. A very big part of the mission of the Spirit, I think, and throughout John's Gospel, is the way to fight evil is to expose it. And I think this is kind of the idea here, that in martyrdom, in Jesus' own cross, evil is being exposed for its true character. Jesus had said the devil is a murderer from the beginning. It's in the cross that we now see that. Sin, the very heart of evil, the heart of the devil, is now manifested for all to see. And of course also concerning righteousness. The Spirit is going to manifest this righteousness. Even though Jesus is no longer seen, this righteousness will now become clear in and through and with the church. In her life, even in her martyrdom, we're going to see this righteousness on display in this conflict with the world. And then finally concerning judgment, and here we bring in the devil, right? Because the ruler of this world, this geographical battle, is now judged and has been judged, kekritai. The victory has in fact been won, and we must always recognize that. The Spirit kind of always convinces us of that He is there and the victory is ours. Well, we want to get to the end of this. We can then go on to 12 to 14. Again here, the very intimacy of the Spirit. If 7 and 8 are kind of how the Spirit interacts with the world, and in the context of a hostile world, now we're going to get in 12 to 14, especially His relationship to the church. And I guess this would even include 15. But He says, verse 12, "Still I have many things I'd like to say to you." He's not been able to say everything He's wanted to say. But He says, "I have many things to say to you, but you're not able to bear them yet." That there is a certain catechesis, and in fact, an ongoing catechesis that needs to take place. This is why the Spirit is going to be given, is that this ongoing catechesis can take place. And so He says, but when that one comes, the Spirit of the truth, He will guide you. Hoda gese. There's the language of hodos, of way, right? Hodos, of the way. This is what the Spirit does. He now guides in the way. And I think you have to see that as the way of the cross. He guides us into the way of the passion of Jesus. The cross, which is the way to the Father, this is what the Spirit does. He guides in the way. In fact, this is language also from Psalm 23, that He guides me in the paths of righteousness. And I think for John, this way is the cross. He's going to guide you into the way of the truth, right? Into all truth. For He will speak now from, not from Himself. And here's kind of now we turn to the Trinitarian character of this. But whatever He hears, He will now speak. And He will speak to you, He will declare to you, He will preach to you. We're going to use that a couple of times. He will preach to you things to come. He will glorify me. There's liturgical language and, in the sense of our confession of Him and our praise of Him. He will glorify me, and out of me, there's the language of source. Jesus will be the very source. I think His very crucified body is the source. Just like the rock of Horeb, the rivers came out of the rock. So out of Jesus' side, the very Spirit is going to come. And so out of me, He will receive out of me, and He will declare it to you. And I think that's where we can kind of end, because what that means then is that the church's worship, the church's prayers, the church's confession, the church's preaching now brings us in to the Trinitarian fellowship. So he ends with the Trinity, that in fact the church is incorporated into the very fellowship of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And I think this is maybe something for you to consider, that the Spirit guides us into this way that incorporates us into the conversation of the Trinity. The Father's conversation with the Son in the Spirit is precisely what we are brought into when we hear the preaching, when we hear Jesus' words, when we hear John's Gospel being read, when we hear the preaching, when we pray. We are given a place in the very intimacy of the Trinitarian fellowship. So again, Jesus is not here talking about leaving the church to its own devices, but in and through the Spirit there is an intimacy in which we are now actually incorporated into the very presence of the Father, so that we too as children can join in the praise and the glory of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Well, that completes this little tour through John 15 and 16. Certainly pray the Lord's blessings upon your Feast of Pentecost and your study of the Word of God. Thank you very much.